is still a really poignant declaration of our principles. It is more pertinent now than it has ever been. Whispers, cool palace grins, and resistance were all things Queen Camilla had braced herself for. However, she was unprepared for the quiet that ensued after King Charles's last remarks. The king altered the pace of her royal life with a single personal choice. Not her public persona, not her title, but something far closer, her access. And Camilla was stunned when the order was confirmed. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Charles didn't speak up. He didn't employ nice excuses, recollections, or pledges to lessen the blow. The room appeared to contract around the queen consort as he merely set the signed order on the table between them. Formal palace rules regulated access procedure, which determined who may enter family-only areas, archives, and private royal chambers, was now a reality. It meant Camilla could no longer enter some parts of the inner palace without permission. It was trust, not her status, that had altered. Camilla gazed at the page as if it had criticized her. As the king's partner, wife, and consort, she had passed through those halls, thinking that her position next to him had finally been acknowledged by the palace. The same walls appeared to respond with a more icy message now. She had less free access to family rooms, sensitive archive areas, and a number of private dwellings. It's what the palace would call order. It was humiliation to her. Charles saw her hands clench around the arms of the chair. He understood the implications of this. Movement was never the only way to gain access within the monarchy. It was about intimacy, self-assurance, and unseen strength. A member of the deepest circle was one who could access the private rooms without being questioned. Outside, a line was someone who had to obtain permission. This was the reason this choice was important. Although it subtly altered Camilla's position of authority, it did not relieve her of her public duties. Camilla attempted to respond. Nothing appeared. For once, the queen didn't have a well-crafted statement prepared, a scathing response, or a firm grin to hide the hurt. One line on the list that was connected to the order had more weight than the others, and it listed the rooms that now needed permission before she could enter. Direct control had been established over a locked tunnel that was linked to confidential royal records. Charles didn't say why. The constraint seemed even more sinister when he remained silent. When the king did look up, his expression was one of grief rather than triumph. He would not retract the final conclusion that he had confirmed. Camilla slowly stood up, her questions still burning in her head. This was not the end of the shock, she realized when she arrived at the door. Somewhere beyond that hallway, William was already waiting, bearing the weight of what Charles had yet to say. However, the palace needed to comprehend the individuals affected by the order before it could comprehend the order itself. Doors, keys, and palace halls were never the only things involved. It has to do with trust. Charles was torn between marriage and duty. Camilla was caught between embarrassment and pride. William stood between the future throne and allegiance. Every look in that tense triangle carried a piece of history. Every silence turned into a warning, and every private feeling had the potential to turn into a public royal fracture. Before anyone mentioned it out loud, Charles was aware of the harm. He was aware that restricting the Queen's access would hurt her more than any public insult could. In official royal life, a ruling king's wife, known as a queen consort, was not intended to feel like a visitor in the palace she assisted in representing. However, the king felt that because certain private family rooms were more than just rooms, the choice had become essential. They contained memories, letters, records, and decisions that would influence the crown's destiny. Camilla experienced the wound in a different way. There was no security precaution that she could see. A message caught her eye. Without letting her alter the narrative before others heard it, Charles had made the choice, signed it, and verified it. Her dignity was taken away by that. Not the paper, not the lock. The impression that before she could defend herself, the palace had already passed judgment on her. She had battled for her position for years. And suddenly that place seemed smaller after a single quiet order. William was aware that his presence would sharpen everything. Even before he entered the room, the prince could feel the tension in his chest because a number of restricted areas were connected to sensitive household documents and future succession planning. The private task of arranging how royal responsibilities, tasks, and power would be transferred to the following generation was known as succession planning. Those chambers did not represent authority for William. They served as defense. His placid face belied his concern, which Camilla perceived as treachery. One private household letter contained Catherine's name, and that one detail turned the tide of the crisis. Instead of using theatrics, the princess had alerted Charles about restrictions within the palace by sending a written report following earlier worries. She felt that before emotion became a greater catastrophe, private family areas needed more explicit protection. In a private discussion with the king, Sophie also counseled caution, warning him that the choice needed to be made discreetly before suffering turned into public harm. After the meeting, Charles stood by himself and ran one hand over the table's edge. As though the shock had left a mark, Camilla's vacant chair remained slightly pushed back. Knowing that it could be safer to remain silent than to defend himself, William waited close by without saying much. However, once Camilla demanded to know who had betrayed her, private handling was no longer an option. Beneath the shock was a moment from earlier that will never be forgotten. There is a beginning to every palace crisis, but the most dangerous ones seldom make their presence known. They start by leaving a door open, a name shouted in the wrong room, a query posed too harshly. For Charles, a controversy in front of the cameras was not the breaking point. He was persuaded that the palace need regulations more powerful than love after a private occurrence at Windsor. Camilla had no idea that night would become a topic of conversation for years to come. The palace was already tense and worn out when the Windsor archive room conflict started during a private family event. An archive room is a secure location where old correspondence, documents, and private family documents are preserved out of the public eye. Aides were writing legacy papers related to upcoming royal responsibilities that evening. The next form of authority within the monarchy was touched by those documents, which made them significant. Before anyone could explain the open corridor, Charles saw it. The Queen was standing close to the entryway as he made his way to the restricted family archive section. She didn't appear to be guilty. She appeared injured. She raised her chin in response to the king's question about why she was there, claiming she had every right to know what was being shielded from her. Shouting was not as effective as that response. It informed Charles that a door was no longer the main issue. It was about pride getting in the way of trust. The prince noticed the shift in his father's expression when William arrived a little while later. It wasn't anger. It was disappointing and colder. The future monarch realized immediately that something had changed irrevocably. He was aware that those historical documents weren't your typical home files. They were linked to upcoming responsibilities, private agreements, and delicate choices that could have long-term effects on the royal family. The crown itself would feel vulnerable if those areas were no longer secure. The most unsettling element was eventually verified by a senior assistant using an official internal account. There was one folder that has been relocated. The household was in a state of terror after just one change. Because even a misplaced folder in a royal archive may indicate an inquiry, a breach, or a concealed hand. Camilla said she didn't touch anything. She claimed that nothing had been taken, searched, or disturbed by her. But the silence that followed her denial weighed more heavily than any accusations. Charles refrained from arguing in public. He merely requested the return of the archive key. Camilla stood at the doorway, gazed at him, and, without blinking, put it in his hand. The king sensed the last line developing between them, but the Queen maintained her pride. Charles was forced to make the final access decision as a result of that incident, which he could no longer ignore. However, the encounter was unavoidable once the ancient wound was ultimately identified. With cautious language and sealed memos, The palace attempted to keep the decision in check. However, Camilla desired something that no document could provide. She desired